Hello, welcome. This is part 2 of my Nikon versus Leica shootout test, and in today's video we're going to particularly look at the Voigtlander 50mm f2 APO Leica M mount or VM lens compared to the Voigtlander 50mm f2 APO Z mount. Leica lens is going to be on the Leica M240, the Voigtlander lens is going to be on the Nikon Z6, and the question is, can you get exactly the same photos from two different cameras if you use the same lens on both bodies? Let's take a look. Hey guys, Matt here from MrLeica.com. So yes, this is part 2 of the two-part video. If you missed part 1, I was talking about the handling of a Nikon Z camera compared to Leica cameras. And if you want to check that out, I can link it below. On that note, I must say a huge thanks to all of you that took the time to comment on the part 1 video explaining that you can customize a function button to zoom in at 50%, 100% or 200% rather than faffing around with the plus and minus buttons as I was doing. But this is particularly looking at image quality side by side, Nikon versus Leica. So we're going to jump into Lightroom. It's going to be some geeky side by side pixel peeping type testing, but that's the best way to see once and for all, are Leica photos different to Nikon photos or any other photos? In this case, it's going to be Nikon versus Leica. Grab yourself a comfy chair and let the pixel peeping commence. So keep an eye on the tags, the red and the blue, because they do change as we go through the different samples to keep you on your toes. So these are shot as explained with the cameras and lenses as shown. And when I zoom in, I can't tell a huge difference between both camera lens setups. Do note that the Leica shots seem to be slightly underexposed, and I think that's because I had the viewfinder set dimmer, or the LCD set dimmer in broad daylight, so I thought I was overexposing. So the exposure difference is kind of user fault rather than anything else. And I just tried to find things of colours and textures to try to illustrate whether or not there's any differences between these two camera lens setups. For my eyes, I can't tell a huge difference from either setup. This image looks almost computer generated and put on after, but it's some fantastic artwork on the side of a building. Again, I can't really tell a difference. I think the colours maybe look slightly deeper from the Leica, but that's because it's slightly darker than the Nikon photo. So I think if you zoom in enough on a big enough screen, I can't really see any difference. And if you show me these photos side by side at a later date, there's no way I could tell the difference between the two camera setups. Let's now talk about the lens. So this is the Z mount version of the Voigtlander APO Lanthar lens. The difference between this and the M mount version is, as we see when we open the box, the Z mount version comes with a metal lens hood, where the VM mount version, the Leica mount version, doesn't come with a lens hood. So that's an added bonus if you want to buy the Nikon Z mount version. My big pro for getting the M mount versus the Nikon version is the M mount version can be used on all the film cameras and basically any camera via an adapter, where the Z mount version is obviously limited to Nikon only. So I think there's a big argument to buy a M mount version and then just get an adapter rather than buy a dedicated Z mount version which is limited to one system. Looking at the lenses side by side, you can see that the Nikon lens is coded, whereas the VM mount version, like an M mount version, is not coded. No Voigtlander VM mount lens is coded, and that sometimes catches out Leica photographers. In terms of size, you can see that the M mount version is very slightly smaller from the front, and it's got a 49mm filter size versus 52mm. Nikon lens is heavier, 347 grams or 12.2 ounces versus 288 grams or 10 ounces. If you're in the US, you can buy the Leica lens for $1,000, the Z mount lens for $850. If you're in the UK, £739 or £700 used. There's actually 3 mounts to this lens: the Z mount, the VM mount, and also Sony E mount. Psst, top tip, shop at Robert White and get an extra 5% off with my Mr. Leica code. Okay, so let's look at some more sample photos. So on the left you have the Leica M240 image, and again it is brighter than the Nikon photo, and that's just because on the LCD it looked darker, so I was trying to compensate to make them look as similar as possible. To my eyes, from kind of this viewing distance, the photos look very similar. When you zoom in, I think the Leica photo might be sharper, and that's because I was using rangefinder focusing compared to focus peaking focusing. Now you'll see the problem with focus peaking in the next image here. So from a distance they look fine, and I was focus peaking to focus on the Nikon, and I was rangefinder focusing on the Leica. The problem with focus peaking is it will show everything red as in it is in focus, but then when you zoom in it's not actually in focus at all. So this Nikon photo is not even slightly in focus, as you can see. And so although the colours are similar, the exposure is different again. This time I overcompensated on the Leica to try to make it look darker, but now it was more dark than the Nikon. But the problem with focus peaking is sometimes it's not accurate. Right, one difference between the Z-mount lens and the VM lens is the Z-mount lens focuses as close as 0.45 meters compared to the standard 0.7 meters of a rangefinder lens. This means for detailed photos, the Z-mount lens is better than the M-mount. However, if you're using the M-mount lens on any mirrorless camera, you can use a close focus M-mount adapter, such as the 7 Artisans adapter that I use, and then you can focus as close as the Z-mount. Okay, here you can see the exposure is completely off, and I'm not sure if the sun changed or if I overcompensated by one stop on the Leica. But in terms of details, if you try to ignore the exposure, the details again are very similar, and the colour palette is also very similar. So those were the pictures. I feel a bit guilty. Every time I talk about Leica, I seem to be like bashing Leica, problems with Leica, having my Leica almost stolen, and now I'm reporting that Leica photos are exactly the same as Nikon photos, and they literally are almost identical. There's no way I could tell the difference between those two sets of images, and I'd like to think you would say the same from seeing it on the screen. Feel free to comment below if you think different. Now, of course, this is not really Leica versus Nikon. This is Voigtlander lens on a Nikon camera versus Voigtlander lens on a Nikon camera. I think the ultimate test to decide whether a Nikon camera is really as good as a Leica camera in terms of image quality, you would then need to test Leica lenses on a Nikon Z-mount body. Voigtlander have discontinued the M to Z adapter, but you can still get third-party adapters. You can also get autofocus like an M-mount lens to other camera adapters, such as this TechArt adapter, which will give you autofocus on your M-mount lenses onto Nikon bodies, and they also do the same for Sony cameras. So maybe in the future, if I get another chance to play with a Nikon Z camera and I get a chance to use it with Leica M lenses or R lenses, for example, then we really can decide whether Nikon is exactly the same as Leica. But from my testing, using the Voigtlander lenses on both bodies, I can't tell the difference. Obviously see part one because it's not exactly like for like. I still prefer using Leica cameras, but it's nice to know that you can get similar image quality, almost identical from a Nikon body. I must say a huge thanks to Flaghead Photographic for sending me the Nikon Z6, the 50mm Z-mount lens, the charger, and the CF card reader to make this video possible to share with you guys. A massive thanks to my awesome patrons. Patreon is my teaching platform, and for more information, links below.